the sisters in the back, if you can't hear, you can come forward if it makes it easier to hear. Hadith 31 is عن أبي العباس سهل بن سعد الساعدي رضي الله عنه قال جاء رجل إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا رسول الله دلني على عمل إذا عملته أحبني الله وحبني الناس فقال أزهد في الدنيا يحبك الله وازهد فيما عند الناس يحبك الناس حديث حسن رواه ابن ماجه. So this is on the authority of Abu Sahel, of Abu Abbas Sahel ibn Sa'd al-Sa'di, may Allah be pleased with him, who said that a man came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, O Messenger of Allah, direct me to an act which if I do it, it will cause Allah to love me and people to love me. And he, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, be indifferent to the world and Allah will love you, and be indifferent to what people possess and they will love you. And this was a hadith that was narrated by Ibn Majah. And so this is a very beautiful hadith, and this is a sahabi that we have not come across before, so we're going to discuss him a little bit. So Sahel bin Sa'd al-Sa'di, may Allah be pleased with him, also known as Abu Abbas. He was a very young sahabi when the Prophet passed away. So he met the Prophet when he was young. The Prophet passed when he was about 15 years old. And he ended up living, Allah bless him, with a very long life. So he was actually the last Sahaba to pass away in Medina. And originally his name was Hazan, which means sorrow or grief. And the Prophet when the Prophet met him, he renamed him to Sa'd, which is like happiness or bliss. And so this was something that a lot of times people think that when you become a Muslim you need to change your name, and that's not true. It's just if you have a name that has an ill meaning or a bad meaning, the Prophet always encourages people to change their names to something good. But if your name is neutral or has a beneficial meaning, there's not a need to change your name. So that's kind of like a side point that came out from that. And his father was actually also another Sahabi, and his father passed away on the way to Badr. He had gotten ready to go to Badr and go out and defend the Muslimin in the battle, but he got ill on the trek there and he passed away on the way. And so Sahel bin Sa'd, many people narrate a lot of hadith from him. He lived a very long life, and so he got to teach many students. Most prominently, he taught his son. His son is named Abbas. And so he narrates 188 hadith. 28 of them are found in both Bukhari and Muslim, like in the two collections together. So it's a good number of hadith. And he later on in his life was tested by Al-Hajjaj, who was a very oppressive Umayyad general. And they branded his neck because they said that he lied. And so it was like he went through some trials later on in his life. And he was the last Sahabi to pass away, like you mentioned. He said that after me there will be no one that can say that they heard directly from the Prophet ﷺ. And he passed away at either the year 88 or 91 after Hijrah. And so that is that Sahabi, Sahel bin Sa'd. And he narrates this hadith, which is a very beautiful hadith. And so again, the hadith is about how do you, tell me something I can do that will allow Allah to love me and allow the people to love me. And the Prophet ﷺ said this concept of zuhud. If you leave the world and love the world, then Allah will love you. And if you leave kind of jealousy or love for what other people possess, then people will love you for that. So we're going to try to get into that a little bit. And so the idea that comes up here is really zuhud. And so zuhud, that's the word that's used in Arabic in both of the situations. It comes from the root word of zahada, and that essentially kind of means to minimize or to suffice with very little. And the opposite, some people have defined its opposite as being raghaba, and raghaba is to desire or to incline towards something. And so zahad is the opposite, to kind of disincline from something. And so in this context, zuhud, when we use it oftentimes in Islam, we oftentimes kind of define it as like a dislike for the world, or turning away from the dunya or the world. But really it's more about sacrificing comfort in this world for comfort in the next. And so the idea isn't that you need to give up comfort for no reason, but the idea is that when sacrificing some comfort can give you some benefit in the hereafter, then you go for that option, which maximizes the hereafter, as opposed to maximizing your comfort in this dunya. And this really comes from a concept that there's no end to luxury. Anytime you pursue a path of luxury, whether it's in cars or housing or whatever, it's an endless hole. And as soon as you reach that thing, you never get satisfied with it. There's always something better than it. There's always someone with more money, better car. There's someone with a better house. There's always something that's more. And so in this dunya, if you're always chasing those comforts, you're never going to be happy in this dunya, and you're sacrificing opportunities to maximize in the hereafter. And so it's kind of like a lose-lose situation, whereas if you are content with what you have in this dunya, you will not only be happy and satisfied in this dunya, but then you'll also be able to maximize in hereafter. And so that's really where this is kind of stemming from. And so Ibn al-Qayyim, he mentioned something that's very beautiful. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawzi, he's a famous scholar from our tradition, and he has a lot of famous works that are about spirituality and like purifying yourself and on zuhud. And so he says really it's like it's an internal attribute, rather like we always think of it in terms of the external, like if someone looks like a zahid, like they have a specific way that they look, and he's saying it's not about the look, it's more about the internal attribute. Because you could be wealthy and you could have a nice car and still be a zahid, whereas someone could be in poverty, in a situation where they don't have anything, yet they won't be a zahid. And it's really about the internal state of the heart. And that state, like kind of to give an example of it, is your attachment to things. So if someone has a love or a desire in their heart, even if they don't have that thing, it's that desire that they have in their heart that makes them not a zahid. Whereas someone who might be wealthy, but that wealth is something that they hold in their hand and they don't hold it in their heart, that means that that is someone who's not going to be affected by that wealth in the same way. And so they can use it for good, they can use it to further themselves and the people around them in this life and the hereafter. And so it's not about trying to seek poverty. The Prophet never advised us to seek poverty, and there's times in the Prophet's life where he was well off. And so it's not like a bad thing to be well off. It's just that what is our end goal? Is the end goal the money itself, or and the material things that we have around us, or is the end goal something greater than that? And another aspect of it is also just combating your desire, your nafs, the inside. Like the nafs is always gonna keep desiring what's in this world. And so it's like kind of like a discipline. You have to be able to discipline the nafs to not seek just satisfaction in like the temporary things that we seek in this world, but kind of a greater satisfaction. And so, a very beautiful concept that comes out of this is that here Allah, like this is the way that Allah is asking us to get closer to Him. And at the end of the day, what Allah really wants for us is the long-term benefit, long-term comfort. Allah wants Jannah for all of us. And He's helping us get there. He wants us to seek that peace in this dunya and hereafter. And so even when we're making these sacrifices, they're only to our own benefit. Like Allah's not going to gain anything out of us making these sacrifices. It's really for our own benefit. The example here in the Quran, it mentions the story of Qarun, who was someone who was super wealthy, just like opulently wealthy, way wealthier than anyone else in his time, super powerful. And people saw him flaunting his wealth, and people prayed, they wished that he had what he had. And the Quran mentions the people who had knowledge, like say like, woe unto you, like how could you wish that you had what he has? You should be content like with what you have, because what he has is like temporary and it's gonna leave with him at the grave. Whereas if you work and you do good works, that's what's gonna like persist in hereafter. And there's also like a very beautiful, I think, way that breaks it down in Surah Hadid. This concept basically shows up a lot in the Quran, but like one thing that we can focus on is the verses in Surah Hadid. Mustafa, do you remember like the can anyone recite it?
يعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد كمثل غيث أعجب الكفار نباته ثم يهيج فتراه مصفرا ثم يكون حطاما وفي الآخرة عذاب شديد ومغفرة من الله ورضوان وما الحياة الدنيا إلا متاع الغرور.
Thank you. We're going to focus on like that beginning part. I didn't have it memorized, so Jazakallah khair for the help there. But Mufti Taqi Asmani, who's a great scholar in the subcontinent in Pakistan right now, and he mentions that this verse in Surah Al-Hadid is one of the greatest miracles, one of the greatest mercies that Allah has provided to us in the form of a verse. And it really breaks it down into these three parts. So he says that essentially this verse is describing all the phases of a human life. You start with the first part, la'ib wa lahu. And so this is kind of playtime. And so he says that in these three parts, he breaks it down to two parts within each three parts. So there's a total of 6 parts. So the first thing is la'ib and lahu. La'ib is really essentially like it's play, but it doesn't have purpose. Lahu is something that is a distraction, but it could have a purpose. And so an example is maybe we start out as kids, we play with a toy, and when we're kids, we think we have it all figured out. We're playing with these toys, we're having a blast. But there's no point at the end of the day of what we're doing. Then that kid grows up a little bit, they reach like 7, 8, 9, they're starting to play basketball. Now their games have a point, they're trying to reach the championship, they're trying to reach a league, they're trying to get, jump higher, become stronger. So here now their playtime has a point to it, and so that's an example of lahu. And what's interesting is that as we progress through each stage, the person will look back and say like, oh, in that previous stage I wasted so much time, I could have done something better with my life. And so like the child who's now playing basketball will look back when they used to play with toys and like, oh man, I could have practiced my free throws. And then you get to the next part, and you get like zina wa tafakhur. Zina is really like this adornment, like the love of beauty of oneself. Whereas tafakhur is the sense of accomplishment or kind of showing off what you've accomplished in life. And so you get to your teens and your young adulthood, and people become obsessed with their beauty and how they look to other people, what other people think about them. And that's epitomized in Instagram, where people sometimes going to the gym for the wrong reasons, or wearing makeup for the wrong reasons. These are all kind of like that example of zina. Like that's what people are desiring at that stage in their life, and they go on to become like tafakhur, like kind of show off what they've accomplished in their life. They drive a fancy car, make sure that everyone knows how big their house is, what their income's like. So those are like examples of that kind of tafakhur, kind of pumping yourself up. And what's interesting is that, again, like you reach these stages, and even after you've reached what you were shooting for, you'll realize when you get there that you're not fulfilled. Maybe you're happy for a little bit, but you're not fulfilled. Like students here at UC Berkeley will understand like how excited they were when they got into Berkeley, but then how quickly that fades when you're here and you're taking a final. You're not thinking of how happy you were to get into Berkeley. And you're always thinking of that next thing. You're thinking of grad school, that job you're going to get, and once you get that job in grad school, like there's going to be something else. And so we're never going to achieve that thing that we're looking for. And then the last thing is that amwal wal awlad, right? So it's the increasing in wealth in our children. And again, we try to seek those next goals. And Allah like really summarizes in these parts, that's like essentially a human lifetime. Like we keep shooting for these goals in each stage in our life. And Allah is saying at the end of it, at the end of all this, like you're not going to become fulfilled in this life or in the hereafter by achieving these things. So that's not the goal. This is just like worldly things. It's not to say that these are bad, but if we keep this in mind, then we're not going to fall in the trap that at the end of our lives looking back, like, wow, I wasted all that time. Just like when we used to look back, like, oh, I wish I played basketball instead of like playing with my toys. When we're going to be like, at the end of our lives, we're going to look back and be like, oh, I wish instead of like just, having like all this focus on tafakhur and like showing off or getting more money, more wealth, more family, I should have focused on something better than that. And so that's kind of like Allah's like warning us about. And so it's beautiful that He tells us this ahead of time rather than like forcing every person to like regret it at the end of their lives. And so another important thing I think to focus here on this concept of zuhud is that like it really comes also with this idea of like tawakkul on Allah. Because a lot of times when we kind of rely on ourselves, we think like, oh, we're getting all our wealth, like we're like self-sufficient, we're working, we're the ones earning the money. And so you feel kind of like, first of all, like an arrogance because you've earned it, and an attachment to what you've earned because you've earned it that way. But there needs to be a realization that like at the end of the day, what's written for us is gonna like, we're gonna get what is written for us no matter what. Like we're not gonna avoid it. If what's written for us is like wealth, we're gonna get it. If what's written for us is poverty, we're gonna get it. And so falling into cycles of either arrogance for what we've earned or kind of fear of poverty in the future is not going to help us at all. It's just going to add unnecessary anxiety. So obviously we do our part, we go to work, we don't stop working, but to realize that like what's written for us is going to happen, and so not to stress about it really, not to become attached to it. And it's kind of like the similitude is like a ship. Like a ship needs the water to float, but as soon as it lets the water inside the ship, it's going to sink. And it's the same thing, like we need means of food and wealth to like get through life and to help our community and to further ourselves. But as soon as we let it into our hearts, then we're going to start sinking in this dunya. So it's the same exact thing. And so a sign to kind of test ourselves where we are is like, we shouldn't be grieving if we lose, and it's a hard state. Like I'm not saying like I've accomplished this, but it's a hard state. If we lose wealth, how do we feel? Do we feel like we're in grief and sorrow? Or is it be like, all right, khalas khair, like inshallah, like Allah will compensate for it? Or when we earn something, do we feel arrogant or greed? Those are kind of like signs we feel in our own heart that tell us how far we are in this path of zuhud. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of a journey instead of a destination. And so, inshallah, like, different things you can become zahid from is from excess, from something that's useless or something that's harmful. And so then just like to end on this note is like, how do we start on this journey of zuhud? And so 3 points here. The first is that realize that your life is going to end. Like no one's going to escape that reality. Your life is going to end. So all these titles we earn, the wealth that we earn, we're going to leave it behind, no matter what it is. And so not to attach ourselves to it. And then the other thing, the second point, is that there's going to be another abode. Like there's going to be hereafter, and our reality there is dependent on how well we do here. So to focus instead our efforts on that, so it's long term. And then lastly acknowledge that what we have is written for us, and it's going to make it to us. So we don't fear poverty or wealth. We're ready for what Allah's written for us, inshallah. And so don't conform to like the culture around us. We live in a very capitalistic, consumerist society, so it's the opposite mentality of this, almost 100% opposite of this. And Umar radiallahu anhu provides a really good example to end on. And he says that greed is, like, if you have greed, that's what really is poverty. Because the more you want, that's what poverty, you're in a state of poverty. Whereas indifference is wealth. As soon as you have zuhd, as soon as you're indifferent to your state, that's wealth, because you're content with what you have. So inshallah, may Allah allow us to be from those people who are amongst the zahideen, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.